Education is the cornerstone of any nation's progress. However, Nigeria is faced with a stark reality. Millions of children lack access to basic education, and many who attend school face significant barriers to success. Nigeria is currently home to one of the world's largest rates of out-of-school children. And this is as a result of the deep-rooted issues of poverty, cultural practices, and in some cases, conflict. The Nigerian National Policy on Education aims to provide equal opportunities for all, but the reality falls far short of its goals. Despite the government's promises, education funding has been dismal, hovering at just 6% of the national budget, and far below the UNESCO recommended 15 to 20%. The results? Overcrowded classrooms, undertrained teachers, and shortage of resources. Investing in education is investing in the future. It's the foundation for economic growth, social stability, and national resilience. Every reform, every policy change, every action taken in the education sector touches lives in ways we may never fully see. But the impact will either position our nation for success or push us farther away from it. It is no longer a question of whether we can afford to invest in education. It's about asking if we can afford not to. In this episode, we'll discuss the policies, both existing and potential, that could address these challenges, taking a look at the need for investment in teacher training, infrastructure, and digital learning. Welcome to the Leading Women Show Policy Series, brought to you by the National Endowment for Democracy and Luminate. I'm your host, Abosede Jojogan, and today we'll discuss investing in the future, education policy in Nigeria, with our guests. Our first guest is Nguyen Fese, an education expert with over 30 years experience. She's currently serving as Senior Strategic Advisor for the UK-funded PLANE initiative. She's committed to improving access to quality education for girls and children with disabilities. Next up, we have Nabila Agwele. She's the Nigeria Chief Executive at the Malala Fund, and she's a global advocate for gender equality and policy change. With over 20 years experience, she serves on influential boards and has championed gender-responsive fiscal policies here in Nigeria. And our final guest is Utibe Hensher. She's the program manager at the Education Partnership Center. She's an experienced senior officer in education management who's skilled in curriculum development, project management, qualitative research, program development, and evaluation. I'm sure you cannot wait to get into this conversation. So let's dive in. So Nguyen, Nabila, and Itibe, welcome to the show. Today we're talking about investing in the future, education policies in Nigeria. It's really interesting, but I feel like if you asked anybody, they would say education is the bedrock of any other policy that you want to talk about or any other thing you want to talk about in terms of economic growth. But we know that there are challenges. So let's start with that, Nguyen. What would you say are the biggest challenges facing Nigeria's education system today?
Well, yes. Thank you very much for having me here today. I agree with you, and I think we all agree that education, without education, really, there can be no national development, period. So we agree that. Unfortunately, we have what we call learning poverty crisis. So what that means is that there are too many children out of school. And even those in school are not learning. So those out of school aren't learning, those in school are not learning. So we have major crisis on our hands. And so it's really, I think some states, as you know, have already declared state education emergencies in their states, because without education, we are not moving. So what do we do? And we really need to look at that and look at it very quickly, and then begin to think through what is it that we can do to address the learning poverty crisis.
Interesting. Nabila, what would you say the biggest challenge that faces our education system?
I would say that there isn't necessarily just one. I mean, there's a suite of challenges that we need to address all at once. I mean, let's be honest, right? On the one hand, there's a systematic and a financing piece. So if you look at our federal financing envelope, our annual budgets, we are far below our commitment, the commitment that we made at the Global Education Summit to contribute 4% of our GDP or 22.5% of our budget to education. That's at federal level. I think at state level, contribution is a bit better, but then if you look at it, if you compare what is overhead, right? So what is, what's actually going to addressing core education issues, there's a huge issue there. And then there's a systems piece, poor coordination, both across federal government and between federal and state. And I have a fiscal policy M&E background, and I'm in the girls' education space. So really believe strongly that we need gender responsive education sector policies, plans, and budgets that speak to the barriers that prevent boys and girls from going to school. So that's the systems and financing piece. Then there's other things, right? There's the poverty, insecurity, the macroeconomic state of things. You know, we're currently dealing with inflation, a huge cost of living crisis. So families are having to make difficult decisions about where they invest their money, their time, who they send to school. Oftentimes you see an impact on girls versus boys. Insecurity is an issue, climate, flooding, and I would say poor policy implementation, but I'm pretty sure we'll get back to that later. So anyone who tells you there's one problem, I think is oversimplifying.
I'm sure.
So we need an integrated, holistic approach.
A suite of things, as you said.
Yeah, and that speaks to diversity across the country as well. Every region, every state has its own unique set of challenges.
Got you. Utibe, what would you add to that?
I mean, I agree with Nabila. We do have a suite of challenges, but I would like to highlight the lack of data. So we talk about the number of out-of-school children in Nigeria. Where are they? What states are they? How many of them are girls? How many of them have been in school and dropped out? And Dr. Fese referred to children in school learning little. You know, how much learning is happening in our classrooms? Are we tracking education outcomes or just inputs and activities? Or we wait until they get to senior secondary level and then we track WAEC results. So data is, what we care about, we measure. And what we don't measure, we don't care about. So data, assessment data, and just stocks and flows in the education system is quite a challenge.
Fantastic. Guya, you've been working in this space for, I don't know how, I don't want to say forever. What are some of the existing policies that you would say have had a significant impact on education, either positively or negatively?
Okay, thanks. I think, as you know, we have a national policy on education. The issue, however, is that we have different tiers of government, and education, as you know, is also on the concurrent list. So although there's a national policy, there's also a challenge as to how states also engage with that policy. Then there's also the universal basic education policy, which prescribes that education should be free at the basic level, should be compulsory, and also available for all children. So that's a very good policy. I think the reason for that was that, because I think one of it was earlier mentioned, Nabila earlier mentioned that the issue around poverty. And so that's a big barrier. So if you say education at the basic, and I'll really restrict my answers to basic education, because as you know, education is huge.
Yes.
There's basic, there's secondary, and there's tertiary, and they all have different approaches that would apply. So for that, for the basic education, because it's free, you would think that everybody would rush to school, right? But there are not enough spaces. So although it's free, the system isn't able to provide enough rooms, enough spaces for those children. So if today we said the 10-something million kids that are out of school all want to come to school, do we have the space? Do we have the teachers to accommodate them? We don't. So the system isn't equipped to deal with that. So although there's also the 2.5% that the consolidated revenue that goes to basic education, is it enough? And the sharing formula also, you would notice that it's even to all states. So Jigawa, for instance, is a small state as compared to Kano, but they get the exact same thing. So do they have the same number of children out of school in Jigawa as they do in Kano? They may have more children in Kano, for instance, but the issues may be different and more in Jigawa, because, you know, I'm just giving those examples. So we don't have the same challenges, and yet we have the same funding mechanism and formula. So that needs to be looked at. And because of the serious issues within this system, we also need to review the policy. Is the 2.5 really sufficient? If it is, or if it's not, even what we have now, are we utilizing it in the best way? Because she earlier talked about the budget allocation. So even if it's 5% that is allocated, is all the 5% going to the right place? How are we allocating it? Today's budget, if you look at it, most of it goes to tertiary. But the problem is more at the basic. So if you don't have the foundation right, and we're saying children can't read, 70% of our children who are in school cannot read. So if they can't read, we need to see there's an emergency. We need to put our money where our mouth is, meaning that you need to fund basic education, not just funding it, but making sure that foundational learning is happening. You know, so children are able to do the math, basic things that they need to do. But what is even compounding it now, that we're in AI era, and we can't even read. We're still talking about reading, you know, and writing. People are talking about AI. So we have all of these things to look at. But I think that we're on the right track in the sense that we at least have the universal basic education policy. We also have a commission that is implementing it. At the state level, the commission is called the State Universal Basic Education Board. We also now have the autonomy for the local government. So it's, I think things are looking, we need to see how that plays out.
Fantastic. Nabila, does any policy, is there any policy that you want to highlight which has had an impact on education, either positively or negatively?
So I'd echo everything that's already been shared. Want to speak to some of the nuances around UBEC and the Universal Basic Education Act and the Commission. In Nigeria, basic education only goes up to junior secondary school. And we at the fund, at the Malala Fund, we focus on adolescent girls' education, secondary school, which captures both junior and senior secondary. And if you look at the data, there's a huge drop in attendance and completion at senior secondary education. A big part of it is because of the financing gap. So we, for the longest time, have advocated for an extension of UBEC to cover senior secondary, because that huge drop, the lack of completion of senior secondary school, especially for girls, has detrimental impacts for them, but also impacts other outcomes as well. Now, that being said, recently there's been a revival of the Senior Secondary Education Commission and the Act, but there are still question marks as to whether that will be fully implemented and the extent to which it will be done in harmony with UBEC. So we have another set of complexities and challenges, and the issue around the funding mix, etc., needs to be revisited. I would say I'm very excited about the Child Rights Act. It's not a new one. It's a 2003 act, but it recently has been domesticated across states, and it sets out the rights of children and specifically has provisions that speak to child labor, the age of marriage, etc. And so with that domestication, there's a need to implement in ways that can improve access and completion of school for children. Child labor is a huge issue, as is early marriage as well across the country. While not an education policy specifically, the Women's Economic Empowerment Policy is groundbreaking. It has several pillars, one of which speaks to skills building and education for women and girls, and specifically focuses on adolescent girl education, and links it to broader development outcomes, which I think is important. Today, where government is facing many resource constraints and prioritizing in different ways, it's so important to frame education in a way that helps stakeholders outside of the education sector understand that it's important. So those I'm very excited about. And also I'll add, there's a set of guidelines that the Ministry of Education has put together, working in partnership with UNICEF, to support the reentry of married and pregnant adolescent girls into school. This is going to be huge. We're going to see some traction in that area moving forward. I mean, across the country, the numbers with respect to early marriage and pregnancy are quite high. So our policies need to take into account those girls and those communities and ensure that they can go to school. If we don't address those particular issues, we won't address our overall out-of-school numbers.
TB, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to add two things. So first, we've talked about the breadth of problems and the constraints that we have in resources, and also that we are in a state of crisis, particularly with foundational learning. That's basic education, you know, the foundation for all kinds of further and advanced learning. So I think we need to have a policy around that. She said something very important that allows entry for other partners. So public-private partnerships is something that we work and we're exploring in the education sector at TEP Center, because we are part of a consortium implementing the PLANE program funded by FCDO, you know, in Nigeria. And so we've been wanting to define and expand the limits of public-private partnerships beyond infrastructural development. We know we need infrastructure, but that's not the only point of entry for private sector in the education sector, for private actors in the education sector. So we do need to define that and also develop. This policy doesn't quite exist yet, but if you're asking what I would like to see, a policy around this learning crisis, that teachers have a policy that empowers them to focus on children's learning as opposed to finishing the syllabus or finishing the scheme of work, that we have a policy that empowers teachers, school leaders, communities, and parents to support what is happening in the classroom in terms of teaching and learning. Yeah.
Fantastic. Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back to continue this conversation. Welcome back. We're still talking about investing in the future education policy in Nigeria. So I want us to talk a little bit about the socio-cultural challenges that we know perpetuate some of the problems that you've already started to talk about. And so, what are some of those socio-cultural problems that we have? Because it's one thing to talk about budget, it's one thing to talk about, but we know that these socio-cultural challenges exist. What are some of them and what can we do about them?
I think the biggest one is the one around gender roles. So for instance, but again, it's not, I think is related also to even issues of economic issues. So for instance, it's easier for a family to release their male child to go to school when resources are scarce than to allow a female, for instance. And also in many of the cultures, you find out that at a certain age, girls are expected to get married. So that again hinders their ability to participate in education. there are many things around, like even supporting families, for instance. Girls are expected to, to be caregivers in many instances. So that kind of limits them in some parts of the country. There are other parts also where we've all noticed that even boys are now not able to go to school. So it's location specific if you're looking at the socio-cultural issues, because there are areas where you see boys have to start to work early, they start businesses early, so that affects them. But mainly it's girls, as we know. Although we've made a lot of strides, to the extent that I can tell you that at the lower primary level, we've got some parity now. So there are as many girls in school as boys. Is the progression, is as they go higher that you begin to see the cultural things affecting, playing in. If you go to some of the schools, even the culture is so serious that it even plays out in class. If you go to some of the primary schools, you'd notice that the boys are in front and the girls are seated at the back. So, and then also the materials that are used in school. So now I think because of the advocacy that has been going on, those schools have now transformed into separating the class. So you have the boys on one side and the girls on one. That's the younger children. But for the older children, it's still very difficult to get to get boys and girls in one place. So that's why you see that they're now advocating for more, having more, girls' schools or boys' schools, just so that you create the environment for girls to thrive and to go to school. So there are many issues. There are issues around early marriage. And early marriage, although we talk about early marriage, it also has medical complications. As we do know, if a girl of 13 has a baby, chances are that she would struggle to have a baby because she's not ready to be a mother. So some of them have this disease that's called VVF. Yes, so again, that causes them to smell because it's very severe. The system is not equipped to deal with it. So sometimes the husband will now divorce you and you now have to fend for yourself. Your parents are poor. The system does not help. Provide. There's no insurance, So it's quite a lot. And then when there's crisis as well, you can tell that usually women and girls suffer more in times of crisis. If you're exposed, then you're exposed to other dangers as well. So, and sometimes the violence within schools also means that girls will not participate in education. Sometimes even the environment, the sheer, fact that there are no toilets, and not just for even the learners. What about the teachers? Because the environment is not welcoming, many women don't want to apply to be teachers. I've been to a school where the female teachers were kept in a room and all of them were seated on the floor because there was not a chair for adult ladies on the floor as a teacher. So we need to look at some of those things. So if you don't have female teachers within the system, there's no role model for girls. So parents will begin to say, but who is going to protect my girl if she goes to school? And if you have an early childhood care where you have maybe age 5 and 6 and is a male teacher in the class, would you want to send your 4-year-old, 5-year-old? Because you have to clean them up when, they make a mess. So some of these things are quite there. They sound like they're little things, but they're things that affect participation in education. The other one, we did a study, back of envelope, very quick study when we were trying to do something on safety, security, and violence-free schools. We discovered that simple things like just stray dogs means that girls will not want to go to school. Wow. Because if you just go out and those dogs begin to come after you, the boys can fight the dogs and play with them. The girls just are scared and they run away. And then the artisans, early morning, you see these mechanics or things, they also harass the poor girls when they're going to school, walking to school. So having schools very far also from home is a bit of a problem for girls. So the mothers would not want to release their girls to go to school. So there are quite a number of issues around that. And for me, unless we look at those issues, each one as serious, we're not going to deal with it. Just saying, have toilet, that's not enough. There are fundamental issues. And I think, like Tibet was saying earlier, data, we must look at the data to be able to address some of these issues. Just blanket things. You know, we used to say, oh, talk to gatekeepers will release, you know, but it's a lot more than that. So I think that the debate has to continue.
So it's not a silver bullet.
No.
Nabila, what are the socio-cultural barriers that we're dealing with? And I think Guyan has outlined a huge number of them. But
yes, absolutely. She's provided an incredibly comprehensive overview. I'd like to echo something she said at the very beginning, which is that social barriers, social norms don't exist in a vacuum. And you find a huge multiplier effect when you layer on access issues, poverty, insecurity. And so these social barriers are much more likely to come into play when you're in situations where families and communities are at a disadvantage. So I'll give you an example. And I think this is why it's also in creating policies and in crafting solutions, you have to go to the communities and get to the root at the cause of the behavior, because sometimes it can feel like it's purely social attitudes, but other times it's families and communities who are making really difficult trade-offs, really difficult decisions that ultimately affect access and completion, especially for girls. So in the Northeast, for example, because of the insecurity and the fact that many girls have been abducted and entered into forced marriage, some families, some communities respond by marrying their girls early to keep them safe. Right? So without understanding the nuance, the incentives behind some of those behaviors layered on top of the other social barriers, you cannot craft and implement policies that get to the root of the issue. So that nexus between insecurity and decision-making is critical. I think also when we think about social norms and social barriers, we often focus our attention on the communities, the parents, the traditional rulers, etc. As someone who comes from the policy-making space, and we're talking about education policy, I think we need to spend more time looking at the ways in which social norms and subconscious biases and mindsets impact policymakers, the gaps in their capacity, their lack of engagement with the very communities and girls and boys who they're trying to serve, leads to policies that are oftentimes unintentionally not linked to real solutions because they don't get at the heart of what is needed at community level. And sort of a related thing for me is in thinking about, okay, we know what the barriers are. We're going to try to be community-centered and research-based and take data and firsthand narratives in crafting solutions. I think we need to also do more to link that work around the social piece of it to what then ends up happening at a policy level. So the social barriers work is happening, it's rich, it's becoming more robust, and I think an area that's quite nascent but it's exciting is that there's increasing recognition that men and boys, especially when it comes to girls' education, need to be part of the conversation. Absolutely. They need to be part of the solution, they need to be carried along. And that work is happening, and those findings, that understanding needs to be informing what policymakers do. The other thing I'll add about sort of the social norms and how they impact even teacher attitudes. We work with a lot of young girls and young women, and one story that is not unusual that shocked me is the extent to which, because of attitudes around whether girls are even going to use their education, there are teachers who will say, you don't need to learn this. You're not going to use this anyway. You're going to get married and sit in your husband's house. So we need to really continue to focus on how these things play out at the community level, but we also need to broaden our lens and look at all the stakeholders, policymakers, teachers themselves, implementers, etc., and be very holistic and intentional in looking at these things.
Yeah. Utibe, what would you add to that?
I mean, I would just really wrap it up because they've really captured it. But I think just overall as a society, we're a bit unclear on what the promise of education is. You know, we don't articulate it very well. So young people, like she was saying, families have to make real trade-offs. You know, when I send my daughter to school, she's at risk of kidnapping, depending on where you live. She's at risk of being harassed. or being forced into early marriage. I might as well marry her off. I know she's safe. I know the family she's married into, and I can get some value for it. So people have to make real trade-offs, or boys that decide to go into business or learn a trade than to go to school. So I think as a society, we need to define what it is that is the value add. Yeah, the promise of education. Even look at the teaching profession. The way that we channel professionals, or the professionalization or deprofessionalization cycle, of teaching. It's quite unclear, sometimes. So if we as a country, we say people who don't achieve certain minimum requirements for other fields, we channel them into teaching. What does that say about, our aspirations, for education? So I think,
promise,
the promise of it. So I think that's one barrier that collectively we need to overcome and define. When we say we're educating children or we're investing in the future, what does that look like?
What does that really mean?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, it's time for us to take another break, and when we return, we'll take some audience questions. Welcome back. So now we're going to take questions from the audience.
Good day. My name is Francis Nwali. I'm a law student. And my question is, a lot of our teaching methods has been outdated. So how can we solve this?
I think the world has moved from when we used to have teachers that were know-it-all, Mr. Know-it-all. Now teachers are supposed to be facilitators, because knowledge is out there. We just talked about technology now. I mean, knowledge is out there. You just need the guidance. You just need somebody to help to facilitate for you to research and find the knowledge. So it's also about how we train our teachers. and lecturers, if you like, because what we found so far, let me give you an example, for those who teach at the primary level, is that they lecture the poor kids, because that's how they were taught. They also in colleges of education were lectured. So they now transferred that. So there was no what we call activity-based learning. But now that's changing, such that you have the teacher becomes a facilitator, but then that means you have to have materials. But if you don't have materials, like our schools don't, they only have chalk and pencil. Really, what you do is to lecture and write on the board, and the kids will copy. So there's a fundamental change that needs to happen, because these resources don't come cheap. You need to have glue, pencil, crayon, colors for these children to use and practice. So because of time, I can't say much, but I just think that the whole training method of the teachers and the lecturers all has to change to align with modern teaching and learning practices.
Usibe, do you want to quickly add to that?
Yes, I think she started it, and just to say, when the teacher becomes a facilitator, it means the children are co-facilitators. So you have to have them involved in their learning. Learning can be abstract. They have to do something, they have to say something, they have to try something in their classroom. So whether that's through play or games, and teaching and learning materials are so important. One of the things we train teachers to do is to create them using things
that they
in
have
the environment, because it's true they can be expensive, but you can find bottle caps, you can find cartons of paper, you can find even sand trays. When you're teaching a child to write, a letter, or you use a sand tray first, get used to the movement. So learning, teaching, it cannot be abstract. The child has to be involved in their learning, and not the teacher one way
lecturing, as you said. All right. Let's take another question.
My name is Regina. I'm enjoying the show. So my question is, how do we ensure that our educational system here in the country allows us to compete with people in other parts of the world?
I think it's less about what you're learning only, and more around how we're training teachers to build critical learning skills, the ability to think independently, to be an ideas generator, to be able to engage in discourse, right, across with people who have a different perspective and come to a conclusion. So I think spending more time really understanding that teaching, school, and the tools we're giving in school are just the basics. Emotional intelligence, being able to communicate both in writing and in person, body language, being able to sell yourself, and then also being able to back your packaging with actual real work. I think also, and this isn't just a Nigeria issue, but in general, really re-emphasizing that there's no better way to learn than to do. So what you learn in school is the foundation, but even abroad, they're moving away from just rote textbook, text learning. You learn by doing, by interning, through practicals, through discourse, and bringing more of that perspective and that understanding will really ensure that as people graduate and enter the workforce and go abroad, they're able to match their peers.
Fantastic. Those were very important questions, and I'm glad that we could delve into them. Before we hear the closing remarks from our guests, let's listen to what some Nigerians have to say.
I'll say declined because looking back, I have a younger sister. Looking back at what I did when I was in primary school, I think I did history and geography in primary school. And then now, I don't think if she was my mate at that time, discussing with her, I don't think she'd be on par with me. I don't think we'll be at the same level. Do you understand what I'm saying? But I try my best to also like instill some of the knowledge I have in her. But personally, I think it has declined.
That's a tricky question because I feel like it has gone through both. It has progressed in some areas and it has also declined in some areas. So.
I think that's very good, especially considering the rate of job applications in Nigeria today. So giving people a chance to learn skills will help them grow more businesses, basically, and increase employment. I think, firstly, every parent should believe that their children should go to school, especially female students too. So they should basically just come together and try to pool funds for children in the community. No, not really.
It's been a truly thought-provoking episode, but before we wrap up, I'd love to hear final thoughts from our guests. TV, let me start with you.
Thank you. I think in closing, I would like to leave us with a question that was posed earlier. As a country, we need to define what we want our population to become. I think education is not an end, it's a means to an end. We talk about our population growing, to 400 million in the next, decade, or Africa's population also growing. There's the statistic that by 2050, one out of 5 of the world's working population will be Africa. So we need to ask ourselves the question, what do we want that person to be? What do we want them to look like? What do we want them to be able to do? Would they be looking for jobs, or would they be learning to read and write, or would they be skilled workers? Who do we want them to be? And then we work backward from that question to our education policy today. So that's, I think, my closing thoughts.
Fantastic. Nabila, what would be your final thoughts?
I think really building on that, when we talk about policy, the instinct is to think about how to make the policies better. What are the new policies that we need? And for me, a major closing thought is that implementation is key. And as we implement, we need to implement in a way that speaks of the realities of our current circumstances. We all know and we all agree that education is critical, skills building and et cetera, and also that it is a critical element of our economic development, especially if you look at adolescent girls' education. the economic gains, the improvement in labor force participation, the improvement in health-seeking behavior, the likelihood that that girl's children will go to school. These are all things that flow from that. So I think really recognizing the link, and then the systems and the financing piece is critical. In an ideal world, government would put more money in the education sector, but with the current reality, that might not be possible. But there's still work to do in saying, federal governments, states, local governments, what are your plans? How do those plans actually link to the problems that we're trying to solve? To what extent are you carrying along civil society? There's so many, we invest in civil society organizations, we give them grants to push on education. We have such a rich ecosystem of civil society actors that are pushing for policies around education, both at policy facing, but also working at communities. How are we engaging the private sector? And are we ensuring that for every naira spent, that money is well spent, can be accounted for, and is going to the heart of the problem that we're trying to solve?
Fantastic. What will you say?
I think for me, it's unacceptable, the level of learning poverty in this country. We have the capacity and the capability to handle it, meaning that we have enough people, we have enough examples of practices that work, both for teacher training and also for how a school should be organized. And therefore, we should be very deliberate about how we address the issue of learning poverty in Nigeria. And to say that every child can learn. If a child isn't learning, it's because the person who is facilitating isn't facilitating well. So if there's so many children in school that are not learning, it means the system has failed them. So we need to be deliberate. We need to think about this system. What do we need to do? I mean, there are countries out there that have done this. How did they do it? And so what can we do very quickly to uproot? It's not acceptable that 10 million children are out of school. And it's also not acceptable that children can't read and write in school. And then those who can transition to secondary school, not being able to read, they move to university and unable to read, they come into the workforce, are unable to be productive. So we can't have any production if we're not. And I think that we can deal with it locally. We have the capacity to do that in Nigeria.
Thank you very much. I mean, as I said earlier, this has been a thought-provoking episode. We would like to say a big thank you to our guests, Ngui and Fese.
Thank you.
Nabila Aguele. And Utibe Henshaw. Thank you so much for joining us on today's episodes. And of course, to our audience, thank you for being such a valuable part of today's discussion. Now, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on social media to share your thoughts on the episode using the hashtag on your screen. I'm your host, Abosede Jojogan, and until next week, remember, women's leadership can change everything everywhere. Bye for now.